Kabul is now a very different place from where it was 20 years ago. You know, it may be possible to get a genuine peace process going between the Afghan Republic and the Taliban, and that would ultimately, perhaps, optimistically lead to a political settlement.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Policy Beats. Today's edition will feature a discussion on the strategic contours of the Afghan peace process and the role of regional and global actors in leading up to the process, as well as planned policy narratives following the peace process. Now, the situation in Afghanistan in the midst of the peace process is unfolding rather quickly, with American forces set to withdraw in September later this year, as violence in the country continues to escalate. To discuss the implications of these developments and more, we are delighted to have with us Ambassador Richard Olson, who is the retired US Ambassador to Pakistan, as well as the former United States Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Good morning, Ambassador Olson. It is a pleasure to have you with us. We'll dive right into the first question.
Ambassador Olson, good afternoon and salam alaikum, by the way. It's a pleasure to be here.
Ambassador Olson, why is the first question that we'll begin today's session with is why the US is withdrawing from Afghanistan in such haste? Now, establishing a timeline for American withdrawal, which might not be in this case contingent on the outcome of the Afghan peace process, and is the US perhaps depriving itself, in essence, of the position to review whether the terms of the deal with Taliban are being met or not? The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, spoke of America's withdrawal as being condition-based. And perhaps an extension to the earlier question I asked of whether America is withdrawing in haste is whether America has softened its stance on Taliban since then, or have the conditions, as General Mark Milley pointed out, changed in any form?
Well, look, this has to do with President Biden's decision of April 14th to withdraw all U.S. forces from Afghanistan. And I would say that particular decision, it's hard not to see that as being not conditions-based. That was based on where the United States and the Taliban had arrived at and where Afghanistan had arrived at. So let me unpack that a little bit. You'll recall that the United States entered into an agreement with the Taliban in February of 2020, the Doha Agreement, under which the US committed to withdraw all its forces by May 1st of 2021. In return for the commitments from the Taliban on al-Qaeda and other commitments, and the start of an Afghan peace process. Now, what happened after that was that the previous administration, even though it wasn't required to under Doha, did a series of drawdowns, two drawdowns, first 8,600 and then down to 2,500 by January. And the US was still committed to complete withdrawal by May 1st. So the administration, the Biden administration, faced a difficult choice, because if they had decided to keep their troops on the ground and maintain a conditions-based approach, then it would have been that would have entailed breaking the Doha Agreement, which would have meant, I think, that the Taliban would have gone back to war with the United States. The peace process might well have come to an end. And we would be back in the sort of same position that we had been in for the previous 20 years. And in addition to that, we only had 2,500 troops, which I think no one would say was enough troops to actually maintain a position against a full Taliban onslaught. So it would have required an escalation of the war. So I think that was a very unpalatable choice for President Biden, and he essentially, in his speech, rejected the conditions-based approach in his announcement.
Right, sir. Continuing, Ambassador, with this about the policy decision, if you recall, the U.S. objectives in Afghanistan have been to seek an Afghanistan that was unified, sovereign, and democratic. Now, do you think and do you firmly believe that the Biden administration's policy decision is consistent with this goal? What do you think, in your assessment, are the real chances of democracy succeeding in Afghanistan?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to be very clear about these things. The United States has, in the course of its long engagement, 2-decade-long engagement in Afghanistan, said many things about why we have a military presence there. I would say that the military presence, and I was a U.S. diplomat serving in the Middle East on 9/11, and was sort of watching this very closely. I would say that the reason the United States went into Afghanistan in October of 2001 in a military way was because Afghanistan was under control of a government that had supported Al-Qaeda and allowed in some sense, the attack on the United States, and more important, refused at that point, the Taliban government refused to turn over Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda leadership to the United States. So that is the reason that we launched military intervention. A lot of the other justifications that you cite, I'm not suggesting they were insincere, I'm suggesting they were added later and were in part a justification for a more extensive engagement by the United States diplomatically in terms of development assistance. If you want to characterize it as, say, nation building, you could say that, but it's, and there's an element of counterinsurgency theory here that you need to be able to support the government that you're backing and its ability to govern and its ability to control territory, which was the analysis about why Al-Qaeda had actually emerged in Afghanistan and threatened the United States, or been invited into Afghanistan, let me say, is probably a more accurate way to say it. So, I think that the goals that the United States had were at various periods more ambitious. And I think we have to keep in mind, and President Biden certainly said in his April 14th decision, his announcement to the American people, that the core issue was a counterterrorism mission, and in his view, the counterterrorism mission had been completed. That's a debatable point, frankly. I mean, I think a lot of people in Washington would debate whether or not the counterterrorism mission is completed. In terms of democracy and the other objectives that the US has pursued and NATO has pursued, the international community, in fact, over the past couple of decades, I think this is going to be very much at this point up to the Afghan people. And this is one of the reasons that the United States did try, not entirely successfully, to launch a peace negotiation between the Taliban and the Afghan stakeholders. And I think that, that's really going to be where it's determined. And the underlying factor is that Afghanistan has changed quite a bit over the past 20 years. It's a much more urbanized country, much more connected to the outside world, much younger country. Most Afghans are young enough they don't even remember the Taliban regime of the 1990s. So I think, that's where there's an area of room for perhaps some degree of optimism in thinking that it will be impossible, even if the Taliban continues to pursue a military solution, it will ultimately not be able to reimpose the conditions that it did or the form of rule that it did in the 1990s.
Ambassador, you rightly mentioned that times are changing. By extension of the previous question, do you think, one of the goals of the Republic had been to secure social freedoms, women's rights, free media, and so on and so forth. So do you think that the US has made any commitment in social economic reforms or development before its exit?
Well, look, obviously we have made, substantial commitments over the course of the past 2 decades in terms of fostering civil society and supporting the rights of women and minorities, and much of our assistance program has been focused on those, and we've spent a substantial amount of money in Afghanistan trying to foster those kinds of institutions and rights. I think that what this essentially boils down to is a question of sort of future leverage for the United States and the international community and the region with the Taliban. And I think it is very clear that the United States and certainly the Europeans will not be inclined to fund a future Afghan government, which in Afghanistan has always really been dependent on foreign assistance and is likely to be dependent on foreign assistance going forward, is unlikely to fund in any significant way or even accept an Afghan government that goes back to the Middle Ages on questions of women's rights and rights of minorities and civil society. So that is an important point of leverage. And again, it argues for getting a genuine Afghan peace process going, but not just a discussion amongst Afghans, but some sort of format which allows the regional countries and the international community to express these views and make clear to the Taliban that is necessary for them to accommodate these concerns, even if they become a more dominant force in Afghan politics.
Thank you, Ambassador. So we'll transition now into the relationship between Pakistan and the US since the start of the conflict, at least. And Pakistan has been viewed with skepticism by the West, specifically the US, in terms of promoting peace or otherwise in Afghanistan, despite the many efforts, sincere efforts that Pakistan has made. And I believe you are in a unique position to explain to us what the correct interpretation might be. But do you think that Pakistan is still a problem, as many have touted Pakistan to be, or has it played a strong role in facilitating a solution by bringing the government and Taliban onto the negotiating table?
Well, I think first of all, I do want to say that from probably about 2002 or 2003 to until 2018, the United States and Pakistan were not aligned entirely with regard to Afghanistan. The stated policy of the government of Pakistan was positive from the U.S. perspective, and of course, Pakistan did play an important role in supporting the U.S., especially through the lines of communication that ran through Pakistani territory, whether terrestrial or in the air. But at the same time, Pakistan was, in fact, providing support to the Taliban. And this was, of course, the divergence between the sort of formal stated policy of the government of Pakistan and the operations of its intelligence services. And that's, by the way, Pakistan's case with regard to Afghanistan. However, that's ancient history. It's important, but it's past. I would say since 2018, the United States and Pakistan have largely been aligned. And frankly, this is because, if I'm candid, the United States has moved much more closely to the Pakistani position, which is to say that Pakistan has always urged us to have a relationship, to develop a relationship with the Taliban and to pursue a peace process, reconciliation, if you want, in Afghanistan. And the United States started, I think, very seriously doing that on a whole of government basis in 2018 with the appointment of Ambassador Khalilzad and the subsequent negotiations with the Taliban, which resulted in the Doha Agreement. And I think that Pakistan has played a positive role with regard to those negotiations in a couple of ways, in concrete ways. First of all, releasing Mullah Baradar from detention in Pakistan and allowing him to go to Doha. Secondly, I think by quietly encouraging the Taliban to negotiate. I think there's probably some room for further flexibility on the part of the Taliban, but Pakistan has been helpful in getting them to the table, and I think somewhat in restraining the Taliban in terms of perhaps the reduction of violence that happened right after the Doha Declaration, the couple of ceasefires that have happened around the two Eid al-Fitrs. And I think that will be important going forward for the Pakistan to urge restraint on the part of the Taliban, especially as the U.S. finalizes its military withdrawal.
Ambassador Olson, if I may, an extension I'm gathering from your answer, a very brief question on how you see the relationship between Pakistan and the U.S. proceeding after the withdrawal of the American troops in September, especially in Afghanistan.
Yeah, well, first of all, just one small point. The president said the troops would be out by September, and I think the indications now are it may well be actually July, because the withdrawal, the so-called retrograde operation, is proceeding quite quickly. So it may be sooner than September. I think that the U.S. And Pakistan are going to continue to be, I think the Afghanistan endgame is going to last longer. And I think the U.S. will continue to want to engage with Pakistan and have Pakistan's support with the peace process. First of all, at least I would argue that there's a necessity for some kind of regional peace process. There's a necessity for having a genuine intra-Afghan negotiation. I think it's likely that there will be, unfortunately, a bloody summer, but perhaps at some point the Taliban will be prepared to engage seriously once U.S. forces are gone and once they've tested the Afghan government. And I think Pakistan will have an important role in that regard. I also think, a topic that has been much in the press in Pakistan lately, and I don't want to say much about this, but the U.S. is going to continue to have some desire to be able to, if things go badly in Afghanistan, to be able to undertake counterterrorism operations. And I don't want to speculate about bases or any of these kinds of things. I don't think that's either constructive or necessarily even where the discussion is. But one thing that I think is fairly certain, I mean, geography dictates that if the United States is going to conduct any kind of counterterrorism operations in Afghanistan, at a minimum, Pakistani airspace is going to be involved. So I think there will be continuing, how shall I say, that there will be continuing important engagement on Afghanistan and counterterrorism issues, even after, because the U.S. is going to disengage in terms of defense, but it's going to continue to engage diplomatically and in terms of development assistance. More broadly, I think over time, the counterterrorism is important to the U.S. still, but it is not the defining framing issue for U.S. foreign policy as it has been for the past several decades, or certainly for the first decade of the millennium. And so I think more likely over time, the relationship is going to be framed with our U.S. ongoing competition, hopefully not confrontation with China. Of course, Pakistan is very close to China, principal beneficiary of the Belt and Road Initiative and CPEC. And so I think there will be questions that arise from that. And I think that will be more likely the framing device for how the Pakistan and the US interact over time. And then finally, there's the question of Pakistan's expressed desire to move away from geostrategy and towards geoeconomics. I think that would be a positive thing. And I think the US could be a useful partner in that regard, but much will depend on what Pakistan does to, frankly, get its own economic house in order.
Ambassador, it's actually great that you mentioned that last bit, because that was my next question to you, and it would have been, do you not think that there's more to their relationship, the US-Pakistan partnership, than primarily Afghanistan or in security-centric relationship? So I think moving forward, I mean, there's a lot of vast areas of cooperation that we could see in the foreseeable future. Let's just move on to the next question, though. Speaking of Afghanistan, the future of Afghanistan, what do you think will be required for a common vision for all political stakeholders to sort of converge in? What is required to get everybody on one page rather than a very absolutistic argument of one winner takes all?
Yeah, well, I agree with you entirely. Look, I think that, you know, the region is really important in this regard. And, you know, my sort of crude and simplistic model of, you know, of the Afghan conflict, which is now more than 40 years in duration, is that it's three interlocking circles. The inner circle is the conflict amongst the Afghans. The intermediate circle is the region, which is regional states, which have at various times intervened in Afghan affairs. And then there's the international or global level. The international or global level, at least on a military basis, is somewhat coming to an end now with the decision to withdraw NATO forces. And the domestic aspect of the conflict is in theory being addressed by the Doha talks, and if they ever get going, the Istanbul process. But there's no real format for bringing the region together. There is the Moscow format, the Moscow Troika Plus, which I think is positive, but perhaps not including as many of the neighbors as would be necessary to really bring something about. In terms of this, so I think there's a need for a modality, first of all. I mean, it's, you know, I'm thinking like a diplomat here, that you need to get people, you know, somehow around a table. But beyond that, in terms of the substance, I think there's this consensus in the region that they want peace in Afghanistan. They want an Afghanistan that doesn't threaten its neighbors, and they do not want to, and the neighbors do not want to intervene via proxies in Afghanistan, in an Afghan civil war. And they are willing to accept some greater role for the Taliban, and perhaps the domination or a more dominant position by Taliban in Afghan politics, but do not want to see of the 1990s, and certainly do not want to see an intensifying civil war in Afghanistan. So I think there's a consensus to be built on in the region, and I think you know, this is an area that would be, it seems to me, quite fruitful for diplomacy by the U.S. and by others, especially the UN, to bring, you know, to hammer out this regional consensus and to get the region to influence both the Taliban and, as necessary, the Republic to negotiate seriously and come to a genuine political settlement that accommodates the concerns of all sides.
All right, Ambassador. So moving on again, based on your answer on the topic that we're discussing right now, the regional implications of the dynamics in Afghanistan. I know you've touched upon how the states, how regional states, and how the situation in Afghanistan needs to pan up or align for this region to have any semblance of stability. But do you think, based on the current standing of the Taliban and even some of the region states, particularly China, Russia, Iran, and India, is any form of any form of an operation between operational workings between Taliban and the region countries possible with the stance that the Taliban have?
Well, look, again, you know, there's the challenge in Afghanistan for all of the regional players, and indeed for, you know, for everyone, has always been the sort of thinking in terms of two tracks, a plan A and a plan B. You know, the plan A for most of the region is to support the peace process in Afghanistan and to you know, arrive in an Afghanistan that it's at peace with itself and at peace with its neighbors. The plan B for almost all the neighbors probably is to actually, choose a side and have the equities of the country represented by some proxy in Afghanistan. And of course, there's a long history of this, right? The problem is that, most of the countries put their foreign ministry in charge of the Plan A and put their intelligence services in charge of the Plan B. And there's a dilemma here because to the extent you're effective on your Plan B, it tends to overwhelm your Plan A. And so I think everyone has to come together and agree on the Plan A in a serious way and put political capital behind it, rather than allowing everything to slide into the sort of the Plan B, which would inevitably result, in my view, in an intensifying civil war in Afghanistan.
Now, Ambassador, my next question is very precedent-based, and I hope, and I'm sure everyone else does, that this does not happen. But in case of a conflict in Afghanistan, continuous conflict in Afghanistan, even after US withdrawal from the country, do you think or do you see adverse economic fallout in Pakistan, given also that the state of poverty in Afghanistan and the state of unemployment in Afghanistan is on the rise? And in addition to it, if a civil war or a conflict does indeed break out, how does that affect Pakistan? We've seen in the past migration flows into Pakistan from Afghanistan have increased substantially with increase in conflict and instability in Afghanistan. Do you think or do you foresee any such future after the US withdraws from Afghanistan?
Well, look, I mean, peering into the future is always a fraught business, right? And none of us has a crystal ball. So, what I would offer you is sort of two scenarios. There's an optimistic scenario and there's a pessimistic scenario. The optimistic scenario is that, I think it's likely one way or another there will be kind of a bloody summer. The Taliban will test the government. And there are a couple things to watch here, on the Republic side. If the Republic maintains its air power and its commandos and its military forces in general, and holds together politically, I think the Taliban will find that it's actually not really possible for them to simply seize power because there are certain there are a lot of advantages actually on the side of the government. I mean, it has larger forces and it has, at least in principle, the use of air power, which means that the Taliban cannot mass forces and take cities. So, that's the optimistic scenario, but it all depends, I would say, on political cohesion on the government side, on the Republic side, more accurately, that everyone comes together and supports the government, and the government doesn't dissolve, or the Republic side doesn't dissolve into factionalism. And again, there's the Plan A, Plan B problem, just as there is for the region. The more pessimistic conclusion is the one you outlined, that there's an intensifying civil war. In other words, if the Republic does not hold together, the Taliban may or may not, be able to actually seize some capitals, some provincial capitals, some of the big cities, Kandahar, Jalalabad, maybe Kabul. In that scenario, yes, I think the consequences for Pakistan are very dire. Because then, it is like, as I said, Kabul is now a very different place from where it was 20 years ago. I mean, it was a city of 200,000 people in 2001. It is now a city of 6 million people. Most of them young, most of them connected with the outside world, most of them familiar with at least, the democratic dispensation and rights dispensation that has characterized the past 20 years. So it's very hard to see that a lot of these people won't actually decide to try to go to leave. And, their destination is going to be to the west, but, geography may send them east and south into Pakistan. So I think refugee flows could be significant. And that would, at a minimum, present Pakistan with a humanitarian crisis and perhaps a dilemma now that the border is increasingly fenced and controlled. But at a minimum, it would present a challenge for the international community, and I think ultimately for Pakistan. So I think this is an incentive for everyone to avoid the sort of that outcome and to work, assiduously to arrive at the optimistic scenario. Because if the optimistic scenario holds, it may be possible to get a genuine peace process going between the Afghan Republic and the Taliban, and that would ultimately, perhaps, optimistically lead to a political settlement. And then you have the possibility of economic interconnectivity, a link to Central Asia, and there are many positive things that one can imagine coming out of the positive scenario. It's hard to imagine anything positive coming out of the pessimistic scenario.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. This has honestly been a great conversation. Courtesy of the virtual web, it's almost like you're back in Pakistan with us. Is there something that do you miss Pakistan? There's one thing that you remember fondly of Pakistan?
Yeah, well, I miss biryani, that's for sure. Yeah. No, I miss my Pakistani friends, and it's a warm and fun place. So I hope now that we're through the pandemic, I'll be able to come back for an occasional visit.
We hope so too. But thank you so much for sparing your time with us. It's been a very educating and enriching discussion. We hope to have further discussions with you too. Thank you so much, Ambassador.
Thank you, Waleed, and thank you, Maheen.
Okay. Thank you very much.
And that's it for our episode of Policy Beats. Please do stay connected with IPRI on all of his social media accounts, Facebook, Twitter, and of course, YouTube. Until then, take care.